freedom is a pure idea. It occurs spontaneously and without instruction.
Yeah.
Well, not quite.
Right.
I mean, it occurs spontaneously, or seems to, but it does actually require instruction, and that has been a lot of what both seasons of Andor have been about. I'm Professor Stephen Dyson.
And I'm Professor Jeff Dudas.
And we are two political scientists who have just watched episodes 10, 11, and 12 of season 2 of Andor. We are here to break down the political themes, ideas, and ideologies that we saw in these episodes. I think, Jeff, we saw 3 major themes running through these episodes. First, freedom and order. Freedom sort of classically encapsulated in the rebellion, and maybe order encapsulated in the empire. But I think one thing we want to talk about is the degree to which these are not entirely separable concepts, that within that order is embedded in freedom and freedom is embedded in order, and that's something that Andor has kind of dramatized very, very effectively. A second major theme that we saw, I think, is farce, particularly from the standpoint of the empire, and particularly the ISB. There were elements of those 3 shows I thought that had the air of a sitcom, but in a way that was not trivial, was actually making a fundamental point, you know, that's not unrelated to the kind of freedom and order dichotomy that we'll talk about first. And then third, I thought the third theme was nothing's ending.
Nothing's ending, the cyclical nature of human relationships, and particularly the cyclical nature of a certain kind of political relationship.
Absolutely. And nothing's ending is, of course, one of the first things Cassian says in the final episode. All right, so let's get into it. Okay, so freedom and order, classically embodied in the rebellion, said to be on the side of freedom, and the empire said to be on the side of order. The sort of case I want to put to you, Jeff, is that these two are not, they can't exist entirely separate from one another, right? They're posed in the show and often in politics as sort of polar opposites, but they actually sort of require each other. And what the show has shown us, in the way that it's had the 2 organizations mirroring each other throughout the series, and in the way that the sort of flaws of each organization kind of manifest themselves, what it's showing us is that freedom requires order, and order requires freedom. And what you actually need is, you know, they're in a dialectical relationship. They can't really be, you can't just have one without the other. What you need is some sort of effective synthesis, but the synthesis is also very, very difficult, if not impossible, to find and to stick with over a long period of time. Yeah,
it's reminiscent, the way that these 2 concepts and practices, freedom and order, are imbricated in one another, as you note, is very reminiscent of, you know, Antonio Gramsci's old claim that hegemony is never complete, that there are always these pockets and spaces of freedom within which to work. And so for sure, that Gramsci's point applies clearly to the empire, right? That order is in fact never complete. There are always these spaces and pockets of freedom within which to operate. And as we'll talk about, it turns out that order requires, for its ends, for the successful accomplishment of its ends, actually requires a fair amount of freedom, improvisation, the ability to shift gears, to traverse over borders or boundaries that turn out to be essentially false, but are claimed to be necessary for the possibility of order to succeed. The other really interesting thing that's going on, as you suggest, in Andor as a whole, is the notion that freedom itself is not, contrary to what Nemec will claim and what we have seen in Nemec's manifesto again and again over 2 seasons, freedom is not actually a pure idea. Freedom itself, as we'll talk about, requires cultivation. It requires discipline. It requires order in order to be successful. And so the way that these 2, as I say, not just concepts, but the practices associated with each of freedom and order are imbricated in one another is really, I agree, I think it's perhaps the most important and obvious theme, certainly of this arc of Andor and maybe of the entire show. So Nemec's manifesto reappears and is extensively quoted for. Is it the middle episode that it's... No, it's the final episode. Episode 12 that it's quoted from fairly extensively. Freedom is a pure idea. It occurs spontaneously and without instruction. Well, not quite. I mean, it occurs spontaneously, or seems to, but it does actually require instruction, and that has been a lot of what both seasons of Andor have been about, is instructing people
in how to be free or in how to make freedom a concept that's manifest in the real world.
Yeah.
There are whole battalions, armies that have no idea they have already enlisted in the cause. Well, again, not quite.
Right.
They're not battalions.
No.
They're not armies, right? They're just people. And they're quite often mavericks, like Saw Gerrera, like Luthen Rail, like Cassian, who are giant pains to the people who need to give them some instruction, some discipline, like General Draven, to some degree.
Senators.
Yeah, Mon Mothma and Bail Organa. It does require cultivation. It does require effort.
Yeah. It requires learning. It requires consistent cultivation, effort, as you say. And Nemec's aspirational vision of freedom as, it's just one more crack in the dam until finally it all bursts through. Well, it's, as you say, it's a yes and no sort of scenario. In some ways, that's true. Perhaps that initial spark or inspiration towards being free is kind of uncultivated and it is spontaneous, but to be effective, to be capable, it requires the kind of organization of someone like Luthen, the kind of spire with, at the center of this vast web of plans in order to bring about or in order to make something relatively effective.
Yeah, and the rebellion, to go to this theme of these things being not quite polar opposites or being polar opposites and yet sort of maybe tragically tied together in a, and just being unable to operate effectively without each other. The rebellion has elements of tyranny, right? Elements of tyranny are starting to be imposed in the reign. No, you may not. Yes, you can. No, you can't. There's a lot of that going on. There's also a sort of tyranny in the means justify the ends kind of consequentialism that Luthen has always preached. And Luthen, in his own way, is shown in episode 10 in the flashbacks, imposing a sort of tyranny on Clea.
Yeah.
Right? Is in disciplining her, in instructing her in the ways to carry out a rebellion in an effective way. And he's aware of this. He says, I'm not scared about many things. I'm scared of what I'm doing to you.
Right.
He recognizes that what he's not giving her is freedom. What he's giving her is a sort of tyrannical commitment to a means ends consequentialism.
I think that's true, although I have a sense that one of the other things that those scenes show us is that Luthen is not as actually influential on Clea as he believes himself to be. She is, even as a young girl, is already driving a lot of what's happening, right? She's the one who knows how to negotiate. She's the one who refuses to look away at the commission of oppression and tyranny at the execution scene. She is the one who is pushing him, right, in a certain way to make the choices that he claims that he is sort of making for her. So I think it's a much more symbiotic relationship between the two of them, and it starts from the beginning.
I was going to say, that's a smart point, because it's his discovery of her kind of stowing away in his... He's like I wonder if we read this in the same way, and we don't do a lot of kind of looking on the internet into the lore and backstory. We just take the text as it's on the screen. He's a sergeant in the Imperial military.
It's gotta be early Imperial, yeah.
And he's been sent on a mission to do horrific things to civilians, and she is one of the civilians to whom horrific things are going to be done.
She's stowed away.
Stows away on his ship, and he's having his own kind of crisis of conscience, and he discovers her, and he's just sort of paralyzed and drinking. Yeah. But you're right, it's the discovery of her that gives him a purpose and an idea and a way to kind of not just be a passive...
Right.
Not just be paralyzed, but actually go out into the world and take action.
Yeah, and I think this is a really good point for us to transition into this, what I think is the scene that is the kind of the meta scene for the entire arc, which is the scene at the very beginning of episode 10, the confrontation between Dedra and Luthen in the art gallery. So we learned several things about Luthen here in episode 10. So his real name is Lear. His last name is Lear. He has made it an anagram, right? So he goes by Luthen Rail, but his real name is Lear. One also wonders, as we are told later, he says to Clea, we are known as Luthen and Clea right now. One wonders if Clea's actual name is also an anagram, right? Is her real name Alec? But the other thing I think that's going on, and I don't think this is coincidental, right? We have another very prominent figure, I mean, with all due respect to a great show like Andor, a significantly more Lear in world culture. King Lear, of course, right? Of Shakespeare. And there's a way that, imagine that Lear, rather than being, King Lear, I should say, rather than being so self-obsessed, so committed to his vision of paternal authority and power, that he requires and demands a show of loyalty and faith and filial capacity from his daughters. Imagine instead that he first has a crisis of conscience like Luthen has. What would the relationship then look like, right? And is Clea kind of a Cordelia figure? Mm-hmm. I don't know exactly. We'd have to kind of suss this out more and think about it more thoroughly. But I don't think there's any way it's a coincidence that Rael is a Lear, a King Lear type figure, but a reconstructed one who seems to reach enlightenment and revelation prior to catastrophe. And it's interesting to maybe think through, and someone who has more time or more consideration of these themes in the future may well find a lot of leverage out of comparing and contrasting, right, these figures, Luthen Rael and King Lear, and trying to suss out what Gilroy might have in mind, or what as an audience we might make of those things.
Yeah, and this continues the long Star Wars tradition of sort of nominative determinism, right? Like the names at Darth Vader, Dark Father, right? Saw Gerrera, like brutal war. Yeah. I mean, it's not, these names are not
real. Of course, is he's actually fake.
Well, so that's the other thing, and Lear and Rael give you those binary opposites that are connected together, and neither of them reach the synthesis of real, right. So it's not, they're both slightly off from the concept they're trying to get to, which I think is a grand theme not only of Andor but of Star Wars in general, and that's that dialogue between.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
Yeah, freedom scares you, Luthen says to Dedra. Dedra says you don't want freedom, you want chaos. Yep. She's disgusted by Luthen and by the rebellion in general. Here you are sort of sheltering in imperial peace and quiet. I think every element of that is really, really sort of significant. I mean, the rebellion contains elements of tyranny, and was shown that. Mm-hmm. The Empire contains elements of freedom. Where the rebellion goes wrong and where the Empire goes wrong is when both kind of try to grip too hard, or try to squeeze out their opposites from within themselves. If the Empire overreaches always, and that's what provokes the rebellion, or that's what internally makes it impossible for it to succeed. Just a bit more allowance for a maverick figure like Dedra.
Oh yeah,
and they've solved this problem, right? Just a little bit less of a tight grip, and they're able to succeed in their mission. And that's because, so certainly on the Imperial side, drawing back from the absolute is not really, that's their fatal flaw, right? They can't draw back from the absolute because they see chaos, disorder, disease, disgust. They react really viscerally to those things and want to purge them and expel them. Whereas the resistance, its great virtue, or the way in which the show shows us that it's ultimately on that side of the equation, is the resistance just has a bit more tolerance, just has a bit more self-control, is just that bit more able to not purge itself of the things it doesn't like, which is its mavericks and its individuals.
Yeah, just a hair more. That's right. And this does throw back to a lot of I think the truth and the accuracy of Nemec's manifesto, right? Tyranny, he says, is unnatural, right? The concentration of massive power is unnatural, and it's unnatural because it is fundamentally insecure, right? And the desire, the bone-deep desire to dominate, to not tolerate difference, is in fact unnatural. And it requires constant diligence and effort, and that diligence and effort does little more than reveal just how insecure the hold on power and the desire for complete control actually is in the first place. And it's not just, as you say, that the Empire overreacts to little acts of rebellion or, chaos on the peripheries and thereby ends up stoking more and more of it. It's that they also completely overreact to their own internal forms of rebellion, improvisation, boundary crossing and the like. And here Dedra is the key figure, I think. So Dedra, we learn since the massacre in Gorman and since Cyril's death, it's been a year, of course, and she has returned to Coruscant. She has entrenched herself again back into the ISB. And what we learn is that during this time, she has renewed her desperate search for Axis. But she's also done a whole lot of freelancing. Right? She is grabbing bits and pieces of data and information from a whole variety of sectors. She's accessing files that she doesn't actually have, should not legitimately have access to herself. And she's putting together this big story. First of all, it's a big story about who Axis is. And remember, the ISB had actually developed or had found the key piece of evidence that Dedra uses to link Axis to Luthen. But because they had secured it through a torture that ended in death, they have buried their incompetence. They've buried their dysfunction in a way that has forced Dedra to go outside of her ordinary lines of command. Well, that information should have come to her.
This is where Dedra and Krennic are having their confrontation, and Krennic says to Dedra, "You've been freelancing, you've been accessing things you shouldn't have done.
You've been a scavenger."
You've been a scavenger. And she says, "Well, I had to because you did." Had tortured to death the person who implicated Luthen Real way before, and you'd failed to give me the really crucial actionable piece, which he's on a Fondor Hallcraft full of antiquities.
Exactly. So it's the incompetence of the Empire that leads them to cover their ass, so to speak, and to bury the information, which then requires Dedra, in order to successfully pursue the goal of order, to have to break a whole series of internal procedures, boundaries, and policies and the like. Of course, she is successful in putting all of this together. But at the same moment that she's putting together the identity of Axis and she's tracing all of these lines of connection with the burgeoning rebellion, she sort of accidentally stumbles upon what's going on with the Death Star. And she sort of accidentally stumbles upon and then can't resist but suss out and trace that story as well about what we know is the sort of the motivating action in Rogue One, which is the role of Galen Erso. And because she has, in her zeal to catch Axis, she stumbled upon this as well, which is really the big story, it turns out. And she's been careless. She hasn't secured her files. She has allowed Lonnie to steal her, essentially to steal her passwords.
Should have used two-factor encryption.
Should have done the 2FA. And it's worse than that because Lonnie's been sitting on this for a year. He's had access to her files for a year and she doesn't know.
Right.
And so she is, on one hand, extraordinarily capable and successful, but in her zeal to bring down Axis and her zeal to redeem herself, perhaps to redeem her sense of mission and meaning after the massacre on Gorman and the death of Cyril, she has been very careless. And then she's careless even more in that the extraction raid that she plans to take Luthen out of the antiquities store is kind of, she does it in hiding. She does it surreptitiously. Krennic suggests that it's half-assed, but it turns out that Krennic himself authorizes a much more half-assed extraction later on. This is the problem that Dedra has. Her acts of freedom, so to speak, her improvisational, spontaneous acts in which she crosses over the boundaries of imperial policy and procedure, they ultimately fail. And that's what gets her in trouble. She has spent 2 seasons doing the exact same thing that she does here in this arc, but she has been broadly seen as being successful. But because she fails, and because Partagaz has already told her at the beginning of this season that Krennic only cares about results, this is her fatal flaw. This is the thing that will require her to, or will lead to her being placed at the very end of the show in a supermax prison.
Yeah, she couldn't quite resist lording it over Luthen. You have to know I've beaten you, I've outsmarted you, and she has to go into his antique shop and she has to kind of do the big reveal of, well, here's an Imperial Star Path. Remember this? Recognize this?
And while she's gloating, Luthen takes the opportunity to try to kill himself.
Yeah. There was a lovely line Luthen said in the shop where she says, "Is everything in here real?" Yes. Which again goes back to that real Leia kind of trichotomy. And he says, Yes, it is. There's only 2 objects in here that are of questionable
2 pieces of questionable provenance in the gallery.
And he only ever mentions one, because of course what he means is me and you. Right.
Well, I think he means, so he's referencing the blade, right, that he will use.
On himself.
And himself.
You don't think it was him and Dedra?
No.
I thought he was, that's really interesting. I thought he was saying we are both kind of, or the show was saying we both don't quite fit into the meta organizations of which we are a part.
Maybe.
Because he says of the knife, he never says this is a fake. He says, well, we who knows, the suspense is building, but of course it rather does its job.
He makes it real.
Yeah.
He makes it real.
Right, exactly. Okay, good. The one final point I wanted to make on this was to talk about a little more about this question of disgust, of chaos, of disease, which is really, really important both in the kind of plot mechanics of the show, but also I think in the meta politics of the show. Freedom and order, and in their extreme kind of tyranny and chaos. There's a very Aristotelian thing going on, like here are the ideal types and here are the corrupted versions of how they see each other. And what is the synthesis? And I think the case we've made is that there isn't a permanent one that's found, but the show does, give us a hint as to what its preferred synthesis is, which is the sort of classical small L liberalism embodied in someone like Mon Mothma, who is sort of exasperated by the chaos and by the Mavericks, but is broadly tolerant of them. The other side of this, the synthesis that is rejected, is the fascism of the empire, right? Yeah. And what is chaos, and especially disease, disgust? You brought up when we were talking before we started
everything is ridiculous,
norm violating from the previous arc. This, of course, is the politics of fascism. Yeah. It's the fascists' response to people who are non-normative, right? Which is they're disgusting. The blood, disgust that must be physically and violently sort of eradicated. And this kind of gives us a clue of the meta politics of the show, which is it's very sort of mid-20th century World War II classical liberalism versus fascism.
Yeah, and everything, as you say, is this desperate attempt to police the boundaries of what counts as normal. It reveals, again, in the way that Nemec indicates, the basic insecurity at the heart of the desire for complete dominance and power. Right. And anything that disrupts or even threatens to disrupt those porous boundaries of the normative universe are reacted to viscerally. And the attempt is not, the express attempt is not to tolerate them or find some way to live with them, but to expunge, to cast out, to stamp out, to destroy. Because after all, these things are, in the callback to the previous arc, they're inexplicable. They are ridiculous. They are absurd. They are, as you say, diseased. These are things that cannot be tolerated precisely because they indicate how unstable and how insecure the desire for and the attempts to police power actually are.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so I think we need to take a break here, and we will be right back with the second of our major themes, which is farce. And we are back with our wrap-up of the political themes that we saw in the final arc of Andor Season 2. We want to talk about these episodes as, or through the lens of farce. I thought these episodes were very funny, but in a way that really made a series of important kind of political points. The ISB in general, in this arc, is a total farce. Yeah. Right. I thought there were huge elements of episode 10 in the hospital that if you'd put the Benny Hill theme tune underneath it, you could have played off as like a sitcom. It's like,
Curb Your Enthusiasm.
Curb Your Enthusiasm. Yeah, like they're on floor 19. No, they're on floor 18. You can't go past here, love. Well, all right, go ahead. That whole thing of like guarding Luthen, which of course, as Dedra keeps saying, is like a pretty big priority. Should have been a priority.
Every single one of them, well, not every single one of them, but all but 2 people abandoned post.
Right.
Go check out the explosions.
Well, that's the funniest thing. It's like, boom, and the explosion actually was a nice callback to Claire and Luthen's, first sort of mission together. She employs the same sort of tactics in True Honor. And by far, why I think this was both funny and expertly done was it never threw you out of the gravity of the moment. It never, like that's a beautiful tribute to Luthen, and you never lose sight of Luthen is dead here or is dying or what Claire has to do. So I think it's very sort of skillfully done. But yeah, she dresses up as a nurse and befuddles all of them. They all go running off in the wrong direction. What's his name is, what's he called? Hurt is Hurt is obsessed with one-upsmanship over Dedra, and so arrests. He's much more concerned with arresting her. And I did think there was some classic sort of analogs to faculty politics here. Like the relationship between all these supervisors is like the relationships between many professors, formally equal, yet want nothing more than to exercise power and control. Right. And so, my fondest wish is I can constrain your freedom of action. Even better, get you in trouble. Well, Jeff, the dean wants to see you. Sorry, there's nothing we... number one goal of people who are formally equal in a hierarchy everywhere, which of course is absolutely farcical as a kind of set of objectives. So huge farce, running different floors, fighting each other instead of the enemy. Running through all this is Dedra is by some measure or by some distance, their smartest, most intuitive thinker, particularly about the rebellion, which she understands because she studied them. I mean, fancy that. She's immersed herself in all the data. Fancy that. And yet they lock her up.
They lock her up, and yet still... And
they still want her advice.
They still go back to her for her advice.
She gives them great advice. Yeah, exactly. And she's kind of their whole MO has been to compartmentalize it, InfoSec, compartmentalize the information so that no one can do what Lonnie's able to do, which is get into one place and put together all these very carefully kind of kept separate pieces of information about the Death Star. But her own kind of, the farce here is her own competence in solving what the Empire sees as its biggest puzzle. It leads her to get all the information into one little treasure box that she then doesn't lock properly.
That she doesn't lock properly, and that she then keeps to herself, because this, after all, as you say, this is her path to glory, to personal success. It always has been in the past, and she imagines this very clearly as her crowning achievement. Yeah. The other really farcical figure here is, it turns out to be Krennic. Krennic reveals himself, and we sort of already knew this, I think, just from Rogue One, but I think it's because of the way that it's played here over the course of the season, it really becomes obvious that Krennic is actually a kind of incompetent, incapable figure. He's played with full menace, for sure. And he's played, I think, at first blush as somebody who is in command of the situation and who is this kind of mastermind who's moving different pieces around the chessboard, so to speak. But it turns out that it's just one up after another with Krennic. And, first of all, he has essentially press-ganged Galen Erso into being his engineer on the Death Star. Well, what happens as a result of that? Well, Erso, first of all, slow walks the entire build and builds in a fatal flaw, which he then leaks out to the budding rebellion. And so this, in part, has put Krennic way behind, on the construction of the Death Star. This then has forced the ISB under Partagaz to basically perform, as in Partagaz's own words, a miracle of keeping the Death Star quiet for, it's got to be like a decade at least now, which is an incredible feat of success. I mean, an extraordinary intelligence success.
It's not small.
No.
by sort of definition.
And when the entire capacity of the Empire has been increasingly geared towards producing and strip mining materials for the production of the Death Star, to keep all of that quiet, to create this entire sort of facade of narrative around the Gorman massacre, to do what they've been doing on Jeddah, which we learn a lot more about in Rogue One. This is a massive intelligence undertaking, and it has been a stunning success. And yet, Partagaz is the one who will fall on the sword for Krennic's failure. Also, Krennic, he's the reason why Dedra has to scavenge, It's his team that goes out and kills the witness, and then he buries that information from Dedra, which forces her to then do the scavenging, which, as you say, results in all of the information and the intricate plans that are supposed to be separated for safety being put into one unlocked box that can be easily exploited. And then finally, Krennic is the one who signs off on Partagaz's sort of improvisational plan with Hirt on the extraction of Clea, which here it says, what should we charge her with? Murder? Subversion? Which presumably would have obviously mobilized a lot more of the Imperial security forces. And it's Partagas who says, no. She's diseased. She's diseased, in a callback to your earlier point. She's diseased, and if she gets out, she could infect thousands and thousands of people. But what that has the effect of doing is it basically deprives the operation of the backup resources that presumably would have been there had they been honest in the first place about what they were doing and why they were searching for her. And so Krennic is constantly screwing up and then blaming everybody else below him, right? In sort of classic dysfunctional organizational bureaucratic hierarchy, the dysfunction starts at the top and then it gets blamed and foisted off onto everybody else, who gets blamed for not being able to continuously do miraculous things in spite of the fact that we've got figures who, against all odds, have succeeded enormously. Partagas' success here in keeping the Death Star quiet for however long they've kept it quiet is an extraordinary success. Dedra's piecing together of all of the story of both Axis and, it turns out, the story of Galen Erso is also an incredible intelligence success. They've both been put in impossible situations, and when inevitably they've experienced failures because it's actually not possible to do the thing forever that they have been forced to do, they're the ones who get blamed. They're the ones who get death marched out in Krennic's language.
The increasingly lengthy death match of the ISB, as Krennic calls it.
Yeah.
I thought Partagas was an interesting figure to talk about here. He's left alone in the room with a revolver and a vodka, or whatever the famous phrase is, and he does the thing that people sometimes do in those situations. As you say, he's probably the most competent of all of them. He's screwed over by it's a very successful operation. He's screwed over by the fact that these things are time limited, and he'd been making that point to Krennic for ages. Like, you got to get a move on, a point that Vader will make to Krennic, coming up in Rogue One, and Krennic just isn't able to get the job done on time. And what Partagas has is a sense of, farce is very close to tragedy, and what Partagas has is a sense of the imbricated nature of those two things. So if you remember when he talks about the Gormans, we can't find the synthetic thing, we've got to kill them all. Bad luck, Gorman, right? And then Partagas says to Krennic, when it looks like it's all falling apart, best of luck to us both, right? So Partagas understands that there are just things beyond the control of even highly competent people like himself. And maybe that's why he's effective, because he is someone within the Empire who's able to not grip too tightly, because he recognizes at core there is just absurdity, chance, bad luck.
And remember, as you noted, I think either in the last pod or the pod before, Partagas is the one who's always reminding people of the game-like nature of what they're doing. Well played, Lonnie. Well played, Dedra. Right? And there is this kind of, you take it seriously, but not too seriously, in a way that perhaps, as you say, frees him to be more improvisational, more free, I suppose, to evade the strictures of order that the imperial bureaucracy has put in place.
Yeah. And then the thing that I think really rammed home that we were operating, at least partly in the realm of farce, was K2SO's kind of role in this. Apparently there was an early conception of Andor, and what it would be was Cassian and K2 going off on missions of the week. And then someone said, well, isn't that The Mandalorian? And it would have been I think, a much worse show. I'm glad they went down this route. Right. But that episode was sort of had a mission of the week, air of it. Cassian and K2 go off. But what I thought was really sort of superb about the screenwriting and the execution here is the thematic point is made that this is a farce and this is the Empire causing its own undoing, because their own droid is turned against them to kind of attack them from the rear and undo their operation to capture Claire and Cassian. And along the way, K2 just makes joke after joke and they're very, very good jokes. The funniest one I thought was the simplest one, which is he kind of walks down the plankway to go to the apartment complex, and the ISB officer or the stormtrooper says, "Are you with us?" And he says, "No," and just swats him out the way.
Well, and then what he says to Cass after having done all this, says, Cassian, I've cleared the way.
Yes, I've cleared a path. So it's just sort of brilliant. And K2SO is in the great tradition of the droids that are on the rebellion side of Star Wars, which is this: once they become on the rebellion side, they assume an element of individualism and an element and kind of the maverick nature. And it was shown, and we didn't comment on it in the past arc, in the reprogramming of K2SO, which was not a beep boop boop.
No,
change the prime directive. This is not RoboCop or whatever. Although actually that's a bad analogy, because precisely the point of RoboCop was he had these kind of leftover biological idiosyncrasies. K2SO's cortex had to be swapped or changed, and it was not clear that it would work. And when it did work, it knocked him a bit silly. In the same way that R2-D2 and C-3PO are instantly kind of silly mavericks, individuals.
Yeah, and it throws back. There's that curious scene from the last arc when Cyril, right before the Gorman massacre takes place, and Cyril is put into the room with a couple of other bureaucrats and all of the K2 droids. And all the K2 droids are, kind of sitting silently and staring at each other, except for one who looks right at Cyril.
Yes.
That ends up being K2.
Right.
And so we sort of get the sense that maybe he's a little screwy to begin with.
Yeah.
Right. That there's something that has gone a little bit idiosyncratic about this droid in the first place.
Right, exactly. Which shows, if you as the Empire can't manufacture droids to be uniform and exercise totalitarian control over it, it shows there's something in the universe that means there are limits to control. And there are limits to free. I mean, we'll get onto this in a second. There are limits to freedom as well. That constantly unconsolidated or unconsolidatable orders. Last point I want to make here.
Let me just, before we get there, one more point. I mean, and this revolves in the universe of the farce, is that the thing that power really cannot tolerate the most is mockery and being made to look or seem ridiculous, which is why those kinds of terms, I'm disgusted, this is ridiculous, this is absurd, right? They are sort of projections of fear, right? Don't make me look or feel ridiculous or dirty or diseased or incompetent or inexplicable, right? Because there is this, it's a confession of their insecurities, right?
Right.
So what totalitarians cannot tolerate the most is mockery, personal mockery, farce.
Yeah.
Right. The pointing out of just how incapable, incompetent, and ludicrous they actually are.
Yeah. Yes. When was the last totalitarian dictator that had a great sense of humor? And answers in the comment section. The last point
we'll wait.
Yeah, exactly. the last point I wanted to make on this, and it would, if this episode was shot in a different register, I would put it as a nitpick, but I think it actually perfectly fits with farce as a theme. And again, I'm not saying these are silly. There is not the Benny Hill soundtrack playing. I'm saying that it is one lens through which you can view the storytelling here, and farce as being very close to tragedy. But the stun grenade they use, which if this is played up as a straight up military assault, you're like, well, that was crap. It rings in your ears a bit, but everyone in that room is still able to function after you've quote unquote stunned.
The only person, so it inadvertently knocks Clay out because it sort of sends her careening into the wall.
Yeah,
but
what's the effective range for these things? He's not in an open field, right? It's just a small apartment,
right?
And the stun grenade you throw in, it kind of fizzled out a little bit, didn't it?
Well, this is not a well-planned operation.
Right.
Look how easily, again, that it is sort of circumvented and destroyed.
Yeah.
Right? By one of their own droids who has been pretty easily reprogrammed.
Right. Absolutely. Okay, so I think that ends our second kind of main political theme of farce, and we will be right back with our final theme, which ironically enough is about the lack of finality.
Yeah. Nothing's ending.
And we are back with our final section on episodes 10, 11, and 12 of season 2 of Andor. We've called this section, or this theme, Nothing's Ending. That's something that Cassian literally says at the beginning of the final episode. Of course, it's true in terms of this narrative. As I think Tony Gilroy has said, the finale of Andor is Rogue One. And just a programming note, I think me and you are going to kind of reconvene early next week, and we're going to do a rewatch of Rogue One in light of Andor.
I think we'll be joining a lot of people.
I think a lot of people are going to do
Rogue One after this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm really looking forward to that, and I'm really, really interested to rewatch it in light of this. So it's true in terms of the narrative. It rather neatly gets Gilroy and Andor out of the common trap that almost every show falls into, which is it's very, very hard to end these kind of intricate shows. You've got to make definitive payoffs and solve puzzles deliberately when definitively when a lot of the joy of the show was in the ambiguity or in the fact that multiple explanations were possible. Very, very hard to stick the ending. Of course, one of the most famous endings of high quality prestige shows was The Sopranos, where what they did was they very deliberately didn't resolve what happened. They just kind of faded to black. I mean, it was an abdication of an ending, but still sort of genius. Anyway, that's all off for another time. Nothing is also ending because we know that the theme of Star Wars is that these clashes of ideologies and of political orders constantly recur, or not constantly, but they recur in kind of long-run cyclical fashion. And the Empire, or the whatever you want to call them, the First Order or the forces of order, are never able to fully consolidate. And neither is the rebellion, the republic, and it's because I think that's true at a macro level that these orders are not able to consolidate. But I think this is true because the first thing we said in this episode, that freedom and order sort of require each other, that they contain seeds of their own destruction, or they're a thesis and antithesis, and no one has yet found a durable synthesis.
Yeah. Freedom might be a pure idea,
right?
But it is not a pure practice, and that contributes, I think, as you say, to the cyclical nature of freedom and order, the degree to which politics doesn't end, right? Politics never ends. The things that communities do to live together, good, bad, indifferent, neutral, those things never end. There is no paradisal political order at the end of some long, progressive, linear march towards progress that would stop politics. It is inevitable and forever. And here we're not just conceptually imbricating freedom and order within one another in a more general sense. The nature of the franchise, the Star Wars franchise itself, as you say, is this kind of consistent cycling of different kinds of regimes. And here it's notable, I think, that one of George Lucas's original and very formative influences were the sort of the artistic vision of Akira Kurosawa, who would famously had a career of portraying Japanese history as this kind of cyclical movement between different forms of power, some of which were better, some of which were worse, some of which were more empowering, some of which were less empowering. And it was just a kind of a circle of politics that never ended. And I think that's Lucas's original vision. It also, from a commercial perspective, means that you don't run out of these stories. You can always continue to tell the story according to the same basic themes of human longing, desire, and oppression. And that makes this universe, it makes it a kind of a folk universe in the same way that other kinds of folk art allow for stories to be presented and represented for each new generation of storytellers. This is Tony Gilroy's distinctive take on the Star Wars universe, but there are other distinctive takes going on as well. Dave Filoni's got a distinctive take going on. There is, of course, the original Lucas take. There are other visions that people are bringing to these characters and bringing to this universe in the same way that folk musicians, for example, revisit and rearrange classic conventional folk songs in ways that appeal to each new generation or each new audience. And so we see that here, and I think you're right, that the key to that is this kind of, is the fidelity, that process of creating and recreating folk art here in the form of the Star Wars universe, the fidelity that has to the overriding theme of the cyclical nature of freedom and order.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's cyclical, and of course that means it's also generational. And you see that in Andor. You see Claire and Luthen kind of training or disciplining Claire. You see now you've got Gale and Erso being sort of introduced into the narrative, which of course is going to bring you Jyn Erso in the Rogue One movie. And then we know once you get into the original movies and once you start bringing back in the Force and the Jedi and so forth, these are whole dynastic, generational father-son type situations, because these problems or these concerns are playing out generation upon generation upon generation. It's a never-ending story. There was an article in the New York Times, an op-ed in the New York Times just before the first episode of this season by Gita Jackson, in which she made the point that Andor was sort of revolutionary art. It was political art, and it had its kind of finger on the scale in the anti-establishment kind of side of things, the I guess, big corporation, anti-capitalism, anti-authoritarianism side of things. And she was saying it's ironic, and she was actually saying she was very uncomfortable with the fact that this was art that was produced by Disney. And so the quote was, "I've always found the overwhelming praise for the show's revolutionary politics to be at odds with the means of its production." I would say that's a reductive reading of what's going on. The art and commerce are always kind of, inextricably interlinked,
always have
with one another. But I think raising this in that meta way just nicely plays into what I think the show was doing in its final arc, which was to show that these are not separate things,
right.
Art and commerce, right? Yeah. And you actually can't have pure commerce without a hint of art,
right?
Because who's going to buy the rubbish, and who's it going to connect to?
Yeah.
And you can't have art without commerce, because how are you going to feed the person who's, Tony Gilroy sits in his basement, and I don't know, what does he do, like make a shadow puppet show of Andor? Like, what effect is that going to have on the world? He needs the exposure and the budget and all the rest of it to get his story kind of out there.
Yeah, and there's another binary that is at work here as well, which is the supposed, and it feeds into this vision of, the supposed binary between pure art and commerce. Here in the show, it's the binary, or the supposed binary, between artifice and authenticity.
Yeah.
And the figure of Luthen Rael is crucial in exploding that binary, right? That it turns out, as he tells Dedra, it doesn't really matter, or as he proves to Dedra, it doesn't really matter whether the things in this gallery are real or not. It doesn't matter what's authentic and what's artificial. It doesn't matter if that blade is a fake or not. He makes it real, right? He has the power to make it real. The artifice and the authentic, this is a false binary in the same way that the pure artistic and the pure commercial is a false binary. The two work together in the same way, of course, that the binary between freedom and order is also a false binary. All of these things are intertwined with one another. They're imbricated with one another in their practice, and they require one another in order to have any kind of meaning.
Yeah, I'd always thought that this is a minor point compared to the profundity of what you've just said, but I always thought that the set design, which has been my traditional role, to make minor gadfly points in opposition to the profundity of your.
Well, people always call you a real Socrates.
I guess so. But the set design of Luthen's shop, I always thought was brilliant throughout. But I particularly liked that once you got outside was Coruscant. And then you didn't just walk through a door. There was a spinning sort of, so everything's given a twist, and you're slightly off kilter as you enter into that store. I thought that was really, really nice. Okay, final point here. We've traditionally had a nitpick at the end of these episodes. The last seconds of screen time go to Bix, who we assumed had left the show at the end of the kind of last arc. And Bix is shown walking through fields of wheat back on, I'm sorry, I've forgotten the name of the planet. It's definitely the same
planet from the first arc.
Yeah, the same place where they were, because the droids are there and everything. And it has that same kind of Days of Heaven, fields of wheat thing going on. And she's holding a child. And this is Cassian's baby, who he doesn't know that he has. Yeah. So we have developed a case or an argument or a proposition that can be argued for or against, that in a show that I think doesn't have a problem with female characters, at least that's my reading of it.
Right.
The handling of Bix, if you were to find an area where it had some of those traditional problems of how are attractive, young female stars handled by these kind of TV shows, Bix would be the one you'd focus on because she's shown tortured and there's a voyeuristic aspect of that and damsel in distress aspects of that. She's shown leered at and nearly raped, again, a very common trope. And then she's shown retreating into domesticity and pushing the public figure, into the public square in a way that not only relegates her to domesticity and pushes him into the public square, but simultaneously totally absolves him of blame. Well, it's not really your choice. You wanted to be the person who did the domestic thing and the emotional thing, but I took that away from you. And in fact, you are kind of suffering for this, right? You're going off and doing the hard thing while I, by implication, do the easy thing. And then the last scene of the show is there is Bix in the most domestic of situations. And what has she been left with? She's been left to look after the baby while Cassian is striding off man of history and man of action. Now, look, you know, that I don't think that's going to change anyone's mind on how Bix's character is being handled. There's certainly a line of argumentation in which you say this is an entirely quote unquote realistic portrayal of, you know, the female experience or of domesticity. B, raising a child is by some distance the most honorable and beautiful and wonderful thing in which you can do. C, Bix had agency. These were all her all decisions. Fine. But if you were already a bit queasy about how that storyline had been handled and you were attuned to some of those tropes, that would do nothing to disabuse you of that concern.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think that it's an answerable question. I think it's a trenchant critique. And I think it really does hinge on what you make of Bix's decision-making. And if you see that decision-making as effectively free and unconstrained by conditions of history and by conditions of expectation, gender expectation in particular, then I think you can look at her arc and be pretty satisfied with it and say, this is somebody who has not always been acted upon by forces from out of her control, but has in fact pursued opportunities and taken opportunities to claw back the narrative of her life. And that she has made a series of consequential decisions that she could have made otherwise. And that her agency is paid off in a satisfying way. If, on the other hand, you imagine Bix as operating under the sort of conditions of unfreedom, so to speak, or under the conditions of ingrained gender expectations and conventions, then it's harder probably to appreciate the character arc that she has. I don't know that it's reconcilable. I think it might be one of those interpretations that truly is in the eye of the beholder and the eye of the audience member.
Yeah, what it does do, I thought, was it adds, and I think this might be my reaction to watching Rogue One again, which I haven't watched for a long time. It adds an additional layer of pathos, tragedy, emotional heft to the end point of Rogue One.
Right.
Which is something that I think we'll discuss next week.
We will.
But for now, this has been I think a really strong end to the series. And as much as it isn't, within the context of nothing's ending, I did think that was elegant.
Yeah. I mean, I think it was a phenomenal season of television. I think the show's 2 seasons really do stand alone, not simply in the Star Wars universe, but they stand out over the last 10 or 15 years of popular culture storytelling.
As always, these were our interpretations and our, pretty much right after the fact reactions, interpretations to the political themes of Andor. We have it every step of the way. Learned a lot from the discussions that go on in the comment section. I think there's much more to say about Andor. I'm going to be rewatching everything, again in the relatively near future, and I think it'll repay that. But for now, I think we should say farewell to Andor and farewell on that bombshell.